She asked when we were getting married, and before I could answer, his mother smiled at him and said, "Well, when?" And the look that crossed his face in that moment told me everything I'd been trying not to know for 2 years. My name is Nadia, and I want to tell you about Marcus, and about his mother Diane, and about the night the three of us sat at a dinner table that felt, by the end of it, like the floor of a courtroom. Marcus and I had been together for 2 years and 4 months when his parents flew in for what he described as a casual visit. I'd met them twice before, once at Christmas, once at a family birthday, and both times Diane had been warm in the way of someone who has decided to be warm because it is the correct performance for the occasion. She asked about my work. She complimented my apartment. She touched my arm when she laughed. She gave me nothing I could point to as evidence of anything, and she gave me everything I needed to understand that she was watching me with a specific kind of attention that had nothing to do with affection. His father, Gerald, was easier. He liked sports and bad jokes, and he meant what he said when he said it, which made him restful to be around. He asked me about my work because he was curious, not because he was assessing whether I was a problem. The visit was 4 days. The dinner happened on day 3. It was at a restaurant Marcus had chosen. Somewhere nice, somewhere with candles, somewhere he'd made a reservation for a month in advance. I noticed that later. You don't make a reservation a month in advance for a casual visit. We ordered, and the wine arrived, and the conversation moved through the usual channels: work, travel, a cousin of Marcus's who'd recently done something either impressive or inadvisable, depending on which parent was telling it. I was relaxed. Genuinely, the evening had the texture of something going well. Then Diane set down her glass, looked between Marcus and me, and said, "So when are you two finally getting married?" She said it lightly, with a smile, the kind of question that presents itself as teasing and functions as something else entirely. The table tilted slightly on its axis. Gerald looked at his bread. Marcus looked at his plate for a half second, just a half second, and then looked up. And Diane looked at him, smile still in place, and said, "Well, when?" Not at me, at him. Like I had briefly ceased to be a participant in the conversation and become, instead, its subject. Marcus laughed. It was a social laugh, the kind that buys time. He said something about not being in a rush, about enjoying where things were, and he reached over and covered my hand with his on the table. And the gesture was meant to read as affection and read to me instead as management. I smiled. I kept smiling. I said something light and deflecting, and Diane accepted the deflection gracefully, and Gerald made a joke, and the dinner moved on. But I had seen the half second. I had seen where Diane had directed the question, and I had felt the quality of that hand on mine, the hand of someone trying to keep a lid on something, not the hand of someone who simply loved me. In the car afterward, I asked Marcus what that was about. He said, "You know how she is. She asks about everything." I said, "She asked you, not us. She looked at you." He said, "Nadia, just my name. The way you say someone's name when you want them to stop." I stopped. For the night. But I didn't stop in the way he meant. I started paying attention to the things I had been comfortable not examining. The way he talked about the future, always in abstractions, always in the eventual, always in a someday that had no month attached to it. The way certain topics arrived and then were gently redirected. The way he'd met every milestone I'd privately been waiting for in a way that felt complete and also somehow preliminary, like each thing was the threshold of a room he hadn't decided whether to enter. 2 weeks after the visit, something happened I hadn't expected. Diane called me. Directly. My number. not Marcus's. She said she wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, because she felt like she didn't know me as well as she'd like to, and she thought that was worth correcting. She said it with such conviction that I almost didn't notice that the lunch she was proposing would happen while Marcus was at a conference, and therefore would not involve him knowing it had occurred. I said yes. I needed to know what she actually wanted to say. We met at a cafe near my office on a Wednesday. She arrived before me, which I noted. People who arrive first to conversations they've requested are people who've been thinking about the conversation longer than you have. She ordered tea. We made small talk for about 4 minutes, and then she opened a different kind of conversation with the efficiency of someone who has limited time and knows what she came to do. She told me she liked me. She said it plainly, with the quality of someone introducing a however. The however was this: Marcus had plans she wasn't sure I was aware of. Not secret plans, plans he'd been building since before we'd met. A potential move to Singapore, where his firm had offered him a senior role he'd been tracking for 3 years. A 2-year commitment minimum, a decision he was supposed to give them an answer on by the end of the quarter. She said she wasn't sure how much of this I knew. I knew none of it. I kept my face completely still. I have practiced this, the ability to receive information that detonates quietly inside your chest while your expression registers mild interest. I said, "He's mentioned the firm's international expansion." She said, "He's past the considering stage. He's deciding." I said, "That's useful to know." She looked at me steadily. She was trying to read me. I gave her nothing to read. What I understood, sitting across from her, was the architecture of the dinner. The question about marriage hadn't been casual. It had been a probe, Diane trying to find out if Marcus had told me about Singapore, if I was expecting a future here that was incompatible with a decision he'd already half made, if I was, in her assessment, a complication he would need to navigate, or a person he had already factored in. The hand on mine. The management. She had been watching him manage me, and she had come to find out how much managing was left to do. I thanked her for lunch. I paid for mine. I told her it was genuinely good to spend time together, and I walked back to my office and sat at my desk, and did not do the thing that was inside my chest, which was to fall apart. Because there were 3 hours left in the workday, and I have always been better at falling apart on my own time. That evening I told Marcus I'd had lunch with his mother. The silence on the other end of the phone was 3 seconds long, which is a very long silence. He said, "She called you?" I said, "She did. She mentioned Singapore." Another silence. Shorter, the silence of someone recalculating. He said he'd been planning to talk to me about it. He said the timing hadn't felt right. He said he didn't want to worry me before he'd made a decision. I said, "You were protecting me from a decision that was going to determine whether we had a future in the same country." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, what he said was, "I didn't know how you'd take it," which means he knew how I'd take it. We met in person 2 days later at my apartment, and had the kind of conversation that takes a relationship that has been operating on a set of comfortable, shared assumptions and replaces those assumptions with facts. The facts were these: he had been seriously considering Singapore for 8 months. He had not told me because he had not yet decided, and he had told himself that not deciding was the same as not having anything to say. He wanted to go. He was afraid that wanting to go was incompatible with being with me, and that confronting that incompatibility would force him to choose, and he had been hoping something would resolve it for him before the choosing arrived. I said, "So you waited for your mother to accidentally tell me at a lunch you didn't know she'd arranged?" He said, "She wasn't supposed to do that." I said, What were you supposed to do? He didn't have an answer that fit inside the conversation. I'm going to tell you what I did, because it's the part people don't expect. I didn't end it that night. I didn't make a speech. I told him I needed time to think, and I meant it in a very specific way. I wasn't stalling, I was actually thinking. About what I wanted. About whether what I wanted could accommodate what he needed. About whether the person who had kept 8 months of a major life decision from me because he was afraid of the conversation was a person I wanted to build a future with anywhere, Singapore included. I talked to my sister. I talked to my therapist. I wrote things down, which I do when I need to know what I actually think, as opposed to what I feel. At the end of 2 weeks, I had a clear answer. I called him and I said, "I think you should take the job." He was quiet. I said, "And I think you should take it without me." Not because I couldn't have considered it, but because the way this went told me something I can't unfind. You had 8 months. You chose management over honesty, and you let your mother be the one to force the conversation. That's not a partnership. That's a performance of one. He said my name, just my name. I said, "I hope Singapore is everything you've been building toward." I mean that. And I did mean it. That's the part that surprises people. I wasn't performing graciousness. I had simply arrived, after 2 weeks of being very honest with myself, at the actual truth of the thing, which was that a person who hides a life-altering decision for 8 months because he fears your reaction has already told you who he is in the most important moments. And I was not willing to board a plane to a different country to find out what the next version of that looked like. Diane sent me a message 2 days later. It said, "I think you made the right call. For both of you." I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because some messages arrive fully complete and don't need anything added to them. There is someone reading this right now who has been on the receiving end of a conversation that was framed as casual and was actually a test. Someone probing to find out what you knew, what you'd tolerate, what you'd been kept in the dark about. Have you ever walked out of a lunch or a dinner or a phone call and realized you'd just been handed the truth someone else had been withholding from you, delivered sideways by someone who wasn't even the person who owed it to you? Subscribe if you're new. There are more of these, and they go places I didn't expect them to go. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one.